A greater obstacle, as impassable as it was unforeseen, obliged a new and indefinite postponement. 1 week before the date set for the wedding, little Remedios woke up in the middle of the night soaked in a hot broth which had exploded in her insides with a kind of tearing belch, and she died 3 days later, poisoned by her own blood, with a pair of twins crossed in her stomach. Amaranta suffered a crisis of conscience. She had begged God with such fervour for something fearful to happen that she would not have to poison Rebecca, that she felt guilty of Remedios' death. That was not the obstacle that she had begged for so much. Remedios had brought a breath of merriment to the house. She had settled down with her husband in a room near the workshop, which she decorated with the dolls and toys of her recent childhood, and her merry vitality overflowed the 4 walls of the bedroom and went like a whirlwind of good health along the porch with the begonias. She would start singing at dawn. She was the only person who dared intervene in the arguments between Rebecca and Amaranta. She plunged into the fatiguing chore of taking care of José Arcadio Buendia. She would bring him his food. She would help him with his daily necessities, wash him with soap and a scrubbing brush, keep his hair and beard free of lice and nits, keep the palm shelter in good condition, and reinforce it with waterproof canvas in stormy weather. In her last months, she had succeeded in communicating with him in phrases of rudimentary Latin. When the son of Aureliana and Pilar Ternera was born and brought to the house and baptized in an intimate ceremony with the name Aureliano José, Remedios decided that he would be considered their oldest child. Her maternal instinct surprised Ursula. Aureliano, for his part, found in her the justification that he needed to live. He worked all day in his workshop, and Remedios would bring him a cup of black coffee in the middle of the morning. They would both visit the Moscotes every night. Aureliano would play endless games of dominoes with his father-in-law, while Remedios chatted with her sisters, or talked to her mother about more important things. The link with the Buendias consolidated Don Apolinar Moscote's authority in the town. On frequent trips to the capital of the province, he succeeded in getting the government to build a school, so that Arcadio, who had inherited the educational enthusiasm of his grandfather, could take charge of it. Through persuasion, he managed to get the majority of houses painted blue in time for the date of national independence. At the urging of Father Nicanor, he arranged for the transfer of Caterino's store to a back street, and he closed down several scandalous establishments that prospered in the centre of town. Once he returned with 6 policemen armed with rifles, to whom he entrusted the maintenance of order, and no one remembered the original agreement not to have armed men in the town. Aureliano enjoyed his father-in-law's efficiency. "You're going to get as fat as he is," his friends would say to him. But his sedentary life, which accentuated his cheekbones and concentrated the sparkle of his eyes, did not increase his weight or alter the parsimony of his character, but on the contrary, it hardened on his lips the straight line of solitary meditation and implacable decision. So deep was the affection that he and his wife had succeeded in arousing in both their families that when Remedios announced that she was going to have a child, even Rebecca and Amaranta declared a truce in order to knit items in blue wool if it was to be a boy, and in pink wool in case it was a girl. She was the last person Arcadio thought about a few years later when he faced the firing squad. Ursula ordered a mourning period of closed doors and windows, with no one entering or leaving except on matters of utmost necessity. She prohibited any talking aloud for a year, and she put Remedios daguerreotype in the place where her body had been laid out, with a black ribbon around it and an oil lamp that was always kept lighted. Future generations, who never let the lamp go out, would be puzzled at that girl in a pleated skirt, white boots, and with an organdy band around her head, and they were never able to connect her with the standard image of a great-grandmother. Amaranta took charge of Aureliano José. She adopted him as a son who would share her solitude and relieve her from the involuntary laudanum that her mad beseeching had thrown into Remedios' coffee. Pietro Crespi would tiptoe in at dusk with a black ribbon on his hat, and he would pay a silent visit to Rebecca, who seemed to be bleeding to death inside the black dress with sleeves down to her wrists. Just the idea of thinking about a new date for the wedding would have been so irreverent that the engagement turned into an eternal relationship, a fatigued love that no one worried about again, as if the lovers, who in other days had sabotaged the lamps in order to kiss, had been abandoned to the free will of death. Having lost her bearings, completely demoralized, Rebecca began eating earth again. Suddenly, when the mourning had gone on so long that the needlepoint sessions began again, someone pushed open the street door at 2 in the afternoon in the mortal silence of the heat, and the braces in the foundation shook with such force that Amaranta and her friends sewing on the porch, Rebecca sucking her finger in her bedroom, Ursula in the kitchen, Aureliano in his workshop, and even José Arcadio Buendia under the solitary chestnut tree, had the impression that an earthquake was breaking up the house. A huge man had arrived. His square shoulders barely fitted through the doorways. He was wearing a medal of Our Lady of Help around his bison neck. His arms and chest were completely covered with cryptic tattooing, and on his right wrist was the tight copper bracelet of the Ninos en Cruz amulet. His skin was tanned by the salt of the open air. His hair was short and straight like the mane of a mule. His jaws were of iron, and he wore a sad smile. He had a belt on that was twice as thick as the cinch of a horse, boots with leggings, and spurs and iron on the heels, and his presence gave the quaking impression of a seismic tremor. He went through the parlour and the living room, carrying some half-worn saddlebags in his hand, and he appeared like a thunderclap on the porch with the begonias where Amaranta and her friends were paralyzed, their needles in the air. "Hello," he said to them in a tired voice, threw the saddlebags on a work table, and went by on his way to the back of the house. "Hello," he said to the startled Rebecca, who saw him pass by the door of her bedroom. "Hello," he said to Aureliano, who was at his silversmith's bench with all 5 senses alert. He did not linger with anyone. He went directly to the kitchen, and there he stopped for the first time at the end of a trip that had begun on the other side of the world. "Hello," he said. Ursula stood for a fraction of a second with her mouth open, looked into his eyes, gave a cry, and flung her arms around his neck, shouting and weeping with joy. It was José Arcadio. He was returning as poor as when he had left, to such an extreme that Ursula had to give him 2 pesos to pay for the rental of his horse. He spoke a Spanish that was larded with sailor slang. They asked where he had been, and he answered, "Out there." He hung his hammock in the room they assigned him, and slept for 3 days. When he woke up, after eating 16 raw eggs, he went directly to Caterina's store, where his monumental size provoked a panic of curiosity among the women. He called for music and cane liquor for everyone, to be put on his bill. He would Indian wrestle with 5 men at the same time. "It can't be done," they said, convinced that they would not be able to move his arm. "He has Ninos en Cruz." Caterino, who did not believe in magical tricks of strength, bet him 12 pesos that he could not move the counter. José Arcadio pulled it out of its place, lifted it over his head, and put it in the street. It took 11 men to put it back. In the heat of the party, he exhibited his unusual masculinity on the bar, completely covered with tattoos of words in several languages, intertwined in blue and red. To the women who were besieging him and coveting him, he put the question as to who would pay the most. The one who had the most money offered him 20 pesos. Then he proposed raffling himself off among them at 10 pesos a chance. It was a fantastic price, because the most sought-after woman earned 8 pesos a night. But they all accepted. They wrote their names on 14 pieces of paper, which they put into a hat, and each woman took one out. When there were only 2 pieces left to draw, it was established to whom they belonged. 5 pesos more from each one, José Arcadio proposed, and I'll share myself with both. He made his living that way. He had been around the world 65 times, enlisted in a crew of sailors without a country. The women who went to bed with him that night in Caterino's store brought him naked into the dance salon, so that people could see that there was not a square inch of his body that was not tattooed, front and back, and from his neck to his toes. He did not succeed in becoming incorporated into the family. He slept all day and spent the night in red light districts, making bets on his strength. On the rare occasion when Ursula got him to sit down at the table, he gave signs of radiant good humour, especially when he told about his adventures in remote countries. He had been shipwrecked and spent 2 weeks adrift in the Sea of Japan, feeding on the body of a comrade who had succumbed to sunstroke, and whose extremely salty flesh, as it cooked in the sun, had a sweet and granular taste. Under a bright noonday sun in the Gulf of Bengal, his ship had killed a sea dragon, in the stomach of which they found the helmet, the buckles, and the weapons of a crusader. In the Caribbean, he had seen the ghost of the pirate ship of Victor Hugo, with its sails torn by the winds of death, the masts chewed by sea worms, and still looking for the course to Guadeloupe. Ursula would weep at the table, as if she were reading the letters that had never arrived, and in which José Arcadio told about his deeds and misadventures. "And there was so much of a home here for you, my son," she would sob, "and so much food thrown to the hogs." But underneath it all, she could not conceive that the boy the gypsies took away was the same lout who would eat half a suckling pig for lunch, and whose flatulence withered the flowers. Something similar took place with the rest of the family. Amaranta could not conceal the repugnance that she felt at the table because of his bestial belching. Arcadio, who never knew the secret of their relationship, scarcely answered the questions that he asked with the obvious idea of gaining his affection. Aureliano tried to relive the times when they slept in the same room, tried to revive the complicity of childhood. But José Arcadio had forgotten about it, because life at sea had saturated his memory with too many things to remember. Only Rebecca succumbed to the first impact. The day that she saw him pass by her bedroom, she thought that Pietro Crespi was a sugary dandy next to that proto-male, whose volcanic breathing could be heard all over the house. She tried to get near him under any pretext. On a certain occasion, José Arcadio looked at her body with shameless attention and said to her, "You're a woman, little sister." Rebecca lost control of herself. She went back to eating earth and the whitewash on the walls with the avidity of previous days, and she sucked her finger with so much anxiety that she developed a callus on her thumb. She vomited up a green liquid with dead leeches in it. She spent nights awake, shaking with fever, fighting against delirium, waiting until the house shook with the return of José Arcadio at dawn. One afternoon, when everyone was having a siesta, she could no longer resist and went to his bedroom. She found him in his shorts, lying in the hammock that he had hung from the beams with the ship's hawser. She was so impressed by his enormous motley nakedness that she felt an impulse to retreat. "Excuse me," she said. "I didn't know you were here." But she lowered her voice so as not to wake anyone up. "Come here," he said. Rebecca obeyed. She stopped beside the hammock in an icy sweat, feeling knots forming in her intestines, while José Arcadio stroked her ankles with the tips of his fingers, then her calves, then her thighs, murmuring, "Oh, little sister, little sister." She had to make a supernatural effort not to die when a startlingly regulated cyclonic power lifted her up by the waist and despoiled her of her intimacy with 3 slashes of its claws and quartered her like a little bird. She managed to thank God for having been born before she lost herself in the inconceivable pleasure of that unbearable pain, splashing in the steaming marsh of the hammock, which absorbed the explosion of blood like a blotter. 3 days later, they were married during the 5 o'clock Mass. José Arcadio had gone to Pietro Crespi's store the day before. He found him giving a zither lesson, and did not draw him aside to speak to him. "I'm going to marry Rebecca," he told him. Pietro Crespi turned pale, gave the zither to one of his pupils, and dismissed the class. When they were alone in the room that was crowded with musical instruments and mechanical toys, Pietro Crespi said, "She's your sister." "I don't care," José Arcadio replied. Pietro Crespi mopped his brow with the handkerchief that was soaked in lavender. "It's against nature," he explained, "and besides, it's against the law." José Arcadio grew impatient, not so much at the argument as over Pietro Crespi's paleness. "Fuck nature 2 times over," he said, "and I've come to tell you not to bother going to ask Rebecca anything." But his brutal deportment broke down when he saw Pietro Crespi's eyes grow moist. "Now," he said to him in a different tone, "if you really like the family, there's Amaranta for you." Father Nicanor revealed in his Sunday sermon that José Arcadio and Rebecca were not brother and sister. Ursula never forgave what she considered an inconceivable lack of respect, and when they came back from church, she forbade the newlyweds to set foot in the house again. For her, it was as if they were dead. So they rented a house across from the cemetery, and established themselves there with no other furniture but José Arcadio's hammock. On their wedding night, a scorpion that had got into her slipper bit Rebecca on the foot. Her tongue went to sleep, but that did not stop them from spending a scandalous honeymoon. The neighbours were startled by the cries that woke up the whole district, as many as 8 times in a single night, and 3 times during siesta, and they prayed that such wild passion would not disturb the peace of the dead. Aureliano was the only one who was concerned about them. He bought them some furniture and gave them some money until José Arcadio recovered his sense of reality and began to work the no-man's land that bordered the courtyard of the house. Amaranta, on the other hand, never did overcome her rancour against Rebecca, even though life offered her a satisfaction of which she had not dreamed. At the initiative of Ursula, who did not know how to repair the shame, Pietro Crespi continued having lunch at the house on Tuesdays, rising above his defeat with a serene dignity. He still wore the black ribbon on his hat as a sign of respect for the family, and he took pleasure in showing his affection for Ursula by bringing her exotic gifts: Portuguese sardines, Turkish rose marmalade, and on one occasion a lovely manila shawl. Amaranta looked after him with a loving diligence. She anticipated his wants, pulled out the threads on the cuffs of his shirt, and embroidered a dozen handkerchiefs with his initials for his birthday. On Tuesdays, after lunch, while she would embroider on the porch, he would keep her happy company. For Pietro Crespi, that woman whom he always had considered and treated as a child was a revelation. Although her temperament lacked grace, she had a rare sensibility for appreciating the things of the world, and had a secret tenderness. One Tuesday, when no one doubted that sooner or later it had to happen, Pietro Crespi asked her to marry him. She did not stop her work. She waited for the hot blush to leave her ears, and gave her voice a serene stress of maturity. "Of course, Crespi," she said, "but when we know each other better, it's never good to be hasty in things." Ursula was confused. In spite of the esteem she had for Pietro Crespi, she could not tell whether his decision was good or bad from the moral point of view, after his prolonged and famous engagement to Rebecca. But she finally accepted it as an unqualified fact, because no one shared her doubts. Aureliano, who was the man of the house, confused her further with his enigmatic and final opinion. "These are not times to go around thinking about weddings." That opinion, which Ursula understood only some months later, was the only sincere one that Aureliano could express at that moment, not only with respect to marriage, but to anything that was not war. He himself, facing a firing squad, would not understand too well the concatenation of the series of subtle but irrevocable accidents that brought him to that point. The death of Remedios had not produced the despair that he had feared. It was rather a dull feeling of rage that gradually dissolved in a solitary and passive frustration similar to the one he had felt during the time he was resigned to living without a woman. He plunged into his work again, but he kept up the custom of playing dominoes with his father-in-law. In a house bound up in mourning, the nightly conversations consolidated the friendship between the two men. "Get married again, Aurelito," his father-in-law would tell him. "I have 6 daughters for you to choose from." On one occasion, on the eve of the elections, Don Apolinar Moscote returned from one of his frequent trips, worried about the political situation in the country. The Liberals were determined to go to war. Since Aureliano at that time had very confused notions about the difference between Conservatives and Liberals, his father-in-law gave him some schematic lessons. The Liberals, he said, were Freemasons, bad people, wanting to hang priests, to institute civil marriage and divorce, to recognize the rights of illegitimate children as equal to those of legitimate ones, and to cut the country up into a federal system that would take power away from the supreme authority. The Conservatives, on the other hand, who had received their power directly from God, proposed the establishment of public order and family morality. They were the defenders of the faith of Christ, of the principle of authority, and were not prepared to permit the country to be broken down into autonomous entities. Because of his humanitarian feelings, Aureliano sympathized with the liberal attitude with respect to the rights of natural children. But in any case, he could not understand how people arrived at the extreme of waging war over things that could not be touched with the hand. It seemed an exaggeration to him that for the elections his father-in-law had them send 6 soldiers armed with rifles under the command of a sergeant to a town with no political passions.